Sir, please don't give them your credit card information. Maya's voice cut through the diner's morning buzz like a desperate plea. Her trembling hand reached toward the elderly gentleman's phone as he sat frozen, confusion clouding his weathered features. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting every wrinkle of uncertainty. Steam rose from his untouched coffee cup, creating a ghostly veil between them. The sounds of clinking silverware and muffled conversations seemed to fade into the background. His fingers hovered over the phone screen, caught between trust and doubt. Maya's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying quiet or risking everything to help a stranger? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever witnessed something that made your heart race like this. Maya Rodriguez had been working at Mel's Diner on Route 9 in Bakersfield, California, for 3 years, ever since she dropped out of community college when her mother's medical bills started piling up. At 22, she carried herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned early that survival meant paying attention to details others missed. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, her uniform pressed despite being secondhand, and her smile genuine even when her feet ached from double shifts. The regulars knew her name, trusted her with their coffee preferences, and occasionally left tips generous enough to cover her bus fare home. She'd grown up in the same small apartment complex where broken dreams and unpaid bills were as common as the distant sound of freight trains. Her mother, Eleanor, had raised her alone after Maya's father disappeared when she was 7, leaving behind only empty promises and a stack of overdue notices. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of rain, while the diner buzzed with its usual mix of truckers, retirees, and locals grabbing breakfast before work. Maya moved between tables with practiced grace, balancing plates of eggs and pancakes, refilling coffee cups and exchanging pleasantries that made each customer feel seen. She'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. The businessman who needed his coffee black and his eggs over easy, the elderly woman who came in every Thursday and ordered the same blueberry muffin, the construction worker who always left exact change but smiled like he was apologizing for not having more. This morning, however, felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an electric tension that made her skin prickle with unease. She'd learned to trust these feelings, remnants of a childhood spent navigating her mother's unpredictable moods and her father's broken promises. At table 7 sat Harold Whitman, though Maya didn't know his name yet. He was in his 70s, impeccably dressed in a navy cardigan and pressed khakis that spoke of comfort and stability. His silver hair was neatly combed, his hands soft and manicured, details that marked him as someone who'd never known the particular exhaustion of working multiple jobs just to survive. He'd ordered the senior breakfast special, extra bacon, orange juice instead of coffee, and had been sitting quietly reading the newspaper when his phone rang. Maya had been wiping down nearby tables when she noticed his posture change from relaxed to rigid, his free hand gripping the edge of the table. The conversation seemed to agitate him, his voice growing higher with each response. She couldn't help but overhear fragments. "Yes, this is Harold. And my grandson is in jail? And how much did you say the bail was?" The caller's voice was tinny through the phone's speaker, professional yet urgent, weaving a story that made Harold's face go pale. They claimed to be calling from the county jail, explaining that his grandson Daniel had been arrested for drunk driving and needed bail money immediately. The voice was convincing, filled with just the right amount of sympathy and bureaucratic authority. Harold's hands shook as he reached for his wallet, his breakfast forgotten and growing cold. Maya felt her stomach drop as she recognized the telltale signs of the scam she'd heard about on the local news. The urgency, the emotional manipulation, the request for immediate payment. Her own grandmother had nearly fallen victim to a similar call 2 years ago, saved only by Maya's cousin who happened to be visiting. The memory of her grandmother's confusion and fear flooded back, making her chest tight with familiar anger. Maya approached the table with deliberate casualness, pretending to refill his water glass while straining to hear more of the conversation. The caller was now instructing Harold to stay on the line, while he walked to the nearest store to purchase gift cards for the bail payment. They claimed the jail's credit card system was down, a lie so transparent it made Maya's hands clench into fists. Harold nodded along, his trusting nature working against him as he absorbed each fabricated detail. The caller painted a picture of Daniel crying in a cell, scared and ashamed, needing his grandfather's help to avoid spending weeks in jail before his court date. Maya watched Harold's face crumple with worry and love for a grandson who was probably safe at home or at work, completely unaware that his name was being used to break his grandfather's heart. "I need to help him," Harold whispered into the phone, his voice thick with emotion. "He's a good boy, he just made a mistake." The caller agreed sympathetically, urging Harold to hurry before the processing office closed for lunch. Maya's hands moved automatically, her body continuing its familiar routine while her mind raced through possibilities. She could walk away, mind her own business, let this gentle old man learn an expensive lesson about trusting strangers. She could pretend she hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen the way his hands trembled as he fumbled for his credit cards. That would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that wouldn't risk her job or draw unwanted attention. But as she looked at Harold's worried face, she saw her own grandmother's confusion, her mother's vulnerability, and every elderly person who'd ever trusted in the goodness of others, only to have that trust weaponized against them. The diner continued its morning rhythm around them, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the ding of the cash register, the comfortable murmur of regular customers discussing weather and local news. None of them knew that a small drama was unfolding at table 7, that an old man's savings and dignity hung in the balance. Maya felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders, the familiar burden of being the one who saw what others missed. Her manager, Carl, was busy in the kitchen, and her fellow waitress, Janet, was handling the breakfast rush with practiced efficiency. The responsibility was hers alone, and she could feel her mother's voice in her head, warning her not to get involved, not to risk the job they desperately needed. But she also heard her grandmother's voice, thanking Maya for being there when a stranger tried to steal her peace of mind. Harold stood up from the booth, his legs unsteady, as the caller continued feeding him instructions. He was supposed to walk to the CVS pharmacy 3 blocks away, purchase $300 worth of iTunes gift cards, and read the numbers to them over the phone. Maya watched him gather his jacket with shaking hands, his face pale with worry and determination. Time was running out. In a few more seconds, he'd be walking out the door, heading toward what would likely be the biggest financial mistake of his retirement. She thought about her own grandfather, who'd passed away when she was 15, and how he'd always told her that doing the right thing wasn't always the easy thing. The memory of his weathered hands guiding hers as he taught her to change a tire flooded back, along with his voice saying, "Maya, sometimes being brave just means speaking up when everyone else stays quiet." Maya made her choice. Setting down her coffee pot with deliberate force, she stepped directly into Harold's path, her heart hammering against her ribs. The words tumbled out before she could second-guess herself, cutting through the scammer's practiced manipulation like a blade through silk. She watched Harold's face shift from confusion to recognition as her warning registered, saw the moment when doubt crept in to challenge the fear that had been driving him toward the door. The phone in his hand seemed to grow heavier as the caller's voice became more insistent, more desperate, revealing the true nature of their intentions. Maya held her breath, waiting to see if her intervention had come in time, if this stranger would trust a young waitress over a voice that had seemed so official, so convincing, so terrifyingly real. The caller's tone changed instantly, becoming aggressive and threatening as they realized their mark was slipping away. "Don't listen to her, sir. Your grandson needs you right now." The desperation in the voice was palpable now, the professional veneer cracking to reveal the predator underneath. Harold looked between Maya and his phone, his confusion deepening as the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Maya's hands were steady now, her voice clear as she prepared to explain what she'd recognized, what she knew, and how close he'd come to losing everything. The morning light streaming through the diner's windows seemed brighter somehow, illuminating a moment that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. She had no idea that her act of simple human kindness was about to set in motion a series of events that would transform her world completely. Harold slowly lowered the phone, his eyes meeting Maya's with a mixture of gratitude and dawning awareness. The caller's voice continued streaming from the speaker, becoming increasingly frantic as they realized their scheme was falling apart. Around them, the diner continued its peaceful morning routine, completely unaware that a quiet act of courage had just taken place. Maya felt her legs shake slightly as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the uncertain aftermath of having done something that felt right but might have consequences she couldn't predict. She'd just saved a stranger from being scammed, but she had no way of knowing that this moment would eventually become the turning point her own life had been waiting for. The simple act of speaking up, of choosing compassion over caution, had planted a seed that would grow into opportunities she'd never dared to dream of. The autumn morning stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities that neither Maya nor Harold could see yet. Her uniform was still wrinkled from the morning rush, her tip still counted in quarters and single-dollar bills, her future still uncertain and tied to double shifts and monthly rent payments. But something fundamental had shifted in that moment when she chose to step forward instead of stepping back. The elderly gentleman before her would soon reveal himself to be more than just another customer, and Maya's life would prove to be balanced on the edge of a transformation that began with nothing more complicated than caring enough about a stranger to speak the truth. As the scammer finally hung up in defeat, and Harold sank back into his booth with shaking hands, Maya realized that some moments choose us rather than the other way around. The morning sun slanted through the diner windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor as Maya watched Harold's face cycle through relief, embarrassment, and something that looked like wonder. She'd acted on instinct, following a moral compass that had been calibrated by years of watching her mother struggle and her grandmother worry, by growing up in a world where people like her were often invisible to people like him. Now, in the aftermath of her intervention, she felt the familiar uncertainty of not knowing what came next. The scammer was gone, Harold was safe, and the breakfast rush would continue around them as if nothing remarkable had happened. But Maya could feel something shifting in the air between them, a connection forming that would prove to be more significant than either of them realized as they stood on the threshold of a story that was just beginning. Harold's hands were steady now as he set his phone face down on the table, his eyes bright with an emotion Maya couldn't quite identify. The morning light caught the silver in his hair and reflected off his wire-rimmed glasses, and for the first time since she'd known him as a customer, she saw him really see her, not just as the young woman who brought his coffee, but as someone who had chosen to protect him when she could have easily looked away. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken gratitude and the weight of what had almost happened. Maya smoothed her uniform self-consciously, suddenly aware that her simple act of kindness had created a bridge between two worlds that rarely intersected, and that she was standing at the center of something that felt much larger than a prevented scam. The story was just beginning, but Maya couldn't know that yet. She couldn't know that Harold Whitman was more than a retired gentleman with a kind smile and exact change. She couldn't know that her intervention would be remembered, discussed, and eventually repaid in ways that would reshape her entire existence. All she knew in that moment was that she'd done the right thing, that an elderly man was safe and that her heart was still racing from the courage it had taken to step forward when staying silent would have been so much easier. The seeds of transformation had been planted, but their growth would unfold in the days and weeks to come, in ways that would prove that sometimes the smallest acts of human decency have the power to change everything. The afternoon shift at Mel's diner stretched endlessly before Maya like a desert highway with no destination in sight. After Harold had thanked her profusely and left with promises to be more careful, the reality of her own situation crashed back down on her shoulders with familiar weight. She moved mechanically between tables, her smile a practiced mask, hiding the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. The lunch crowd demanded her attention, businessmen gulping down sandwiches between phone calls, mothers juggling toddlers and trying to eat with one hand, construction workers seeking refuge from the October heat. But her mind kept drifting to the envelope tucked in her locker, the one marked final notice in red letters, that seemed to burn through the thin metal door. The rent was 3 days overdue, and Mrs. Patterson, her landlord, had already called twice this morning. Each ring of the phone made Maya's stomach clench with the familiar anxiety of someone always one paycheck away from disaster. The weight of financial desperation pressed against her chest like a physical force, making it hard to breathe in the diner's grease-scented air. She'd been working double shifts for 2 weeks straight, covering for Janet, who'd called in sick, with what everyone suspected was another bout of depression. The extra hours meant extra tips, but also meant coming home after midnight to find her mother still awake, worry etched in the lines around her eyes as she pretended to watch late-night television. Elena Rodriguez had aged 10 years in the past too, ever since the cancer diagnosis that had turned their modest savings into medical debt. Maya's father's abandonment had taught them both to rely only on themselves, but sometimes the burden felt too heavy for one person to carry. The dreams she'd had of finishing college, of becoming a teacher or maybe a social worker, seemed as distant as the Hollywood sign she could sometimes glimpse on clear days from the diner's back door. Maya paused in the break room during her 15-minute break, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes, and her uniform bore the stains of a morning spent serving others, while her own life felt like it was unraveling thread by thread. She thought about Harold's gentle face, the way his hands had shaken when he'd realized how close he'd come to losing his money. At least she'd been able to help someone today, even if she couldn't seem to help herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved a wealthy man from a scam while her own life was slowly being consumed by the legal but equally devastating scam of poverty wages and impossible healthcare costs. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping to wash away the fatigue that seemed to live in her bones now, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt genuinely hopeful about anything. Her childhood home had been filled with her mother's laughter before the illness, before Maya's father had proven himself to be the kind of man who disappeared when things got difficult. She remembered being 8 years old, helping her mother make tamales for Christmas, flour dusting their hair as they worked side by side in their tiny kitchen. Eleanor had been a secretary then, proud of her typing speed and her ability to manage her boss's chaotic schedule. She'd worn pressed blouses and pencil skirts, her hair always perfectly styled, her dreams focused on providing Maya with opportunities she'd never had herself. Those memories felt like photographs from someone else's life now, distant and faded, but still capable of bringing tears to Maya's eyes when she let her guard down. The woman who now spent her days in a faded bathrobe, too weak from chemotherapy to do more than smile when Maya brought her soup, seemed like a different person entirely. The afternoon customers blurred together as Maya served coffee and cleared tables, her body operating on autopilot, while her mind wandered through the maze of her current problems. The gas bill had arrived yesterday, adding another layer to the stack of envelopes she couldn't bear to open. Her car was making a grinding noise that probably meant expensive repairs she couldn't afford, but without it, she couldn't get to work. The bus system in Bakersfield was unreliable at best, and working the late shift meant walking home alone through neighborhoods that weren't safe for a young woman carrying tip money. She'd tried applying for other jobs, office work that might pay better and offer health insurance, but her incomplete college education and gap in employment history worked against her. Every rejection letter felt like another door slamming shut, another path toward a better future blocked by circumstances beyond her control. At table 12, a businessman complained loudly about his burger being overcooked, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd never had to worry about where his next meal was coming from. Maya apologized and took the plate back to the kitchen, where Carl, the cook, rolled his eyes and muttered about entitled customers. She found herself thinking about the different worlds that coexisted in the same space. The customers who left $2 tips on $20 meals, the regulars who counted out exact change from coin purses, the occasional big tipper who made her day but couldn't change her life. Today Harold had been something different entirely, someone who'd looked at her with genuine gratitude, who'd seen her as a person rather than just a service provider. The memory of his relief when she'd explained about the scam warmed her more than any tip could have, but warmth didn't pay rent or medical bills. The clock on the wall seemed to move backward as the afternoon dragged on, each minute stretching like taffy under the fluorescent lights. Maya's feet ached in her discount sneakers, and she could feel a headache building behind her eyes from the combination of stress and poor sleep. She'd been having the same recurring dream for weeks, standing in an endless hallway lined with doors that wouldn't open, each one marked with a bill she couldn't pay or an opportunity she couldn't reach. She'd wake up with her heart racing, momentarily disoriented before the familiar weight of reality settled back on her chest. Her mother would call out from the next room, asking if she was okay, and Maya would force brightness into her voice as she assured Elena that everything was fine, that she'd just had a bad dream. The truth was that Maya's life felt like a series of closed doors and limited options, each day a carefully managed exercise in making impossible choices. Should she buy groceries or put gas in the car? Should she pay the electric bill or save money for her mother's next doctor's appointment. The math never worked out in their favor, no matter how carefully she calculated and recalculated their expenses. She'd become an expert at stretching dollars, at finding creative ways to make meals from whatever was in their nearly empty refrigerator, at smiling through the embarrassment of using food stamps at the grocery store while former classmates from high school looked away uncomfortably. The American dream felt like a cruel joke, told at the expense of people like her. People who worked hard but couldn't seem to get ahead, who played by the rules but still couldn't win. Maya's reflection caught her eye again in the chrome surface of the coffee machine, distorted and wavering like a funhouse mirror image of the person she used to be. She remembered being 18 and fearless, certain that college would be her ticket to a better life. She'd had plans then, big, ambitious plans that had seemed not just possible, but inevitable. She was going to study social work, help families like her own, navigate the systems that seemed designed to keep them trapped. She was going to make a difference, earn enough money to take care of her mother properly, maybe even save enough to buy a small house with a garden where Elena could grow the tomatoes she was always talking about. Those dreams hadn't died all at once. They'd eroded slowly, worn away by the daily grind of survival until only their shadows remained. The dinner rush was beginning to build as commuters stopped for quick meals before heading home to houses Maya could only imagine. She watched them through the window, families in SUVs, couples holding hands as they walked to their cars, teenagers with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Sometimes she wondered what her life would have looked like if her father had stayed, if her mother hadn't gotten sick, if any of a dozen different variables had aligned in their favor instead of against them. But wondering felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, a distraction from the immediate concerns that demanded her attention. The rent wouldn't pay itself, and her mother's prescription refill was due next week, and the car's grinding noise was getting worse every day. As the sun began to set behind the mountains that ringed Bakersfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Maya of better times, she felt the familiar ache of loneliness that came with being too young to feel so old. Her classmates from high school were finishing college now, posting pictures on social media of graduation ceremonies and job interviews and engagement parties. Maya had stopped checking Facebook months ago. The contrast between their lives and hers was too painful to witness regularly. She'd become skilled at deflecting questions about her plans, at changing the subject when former friends asked about school or work. The shame of her circumstances felt like a constant weight, even though she knew intellectually that poverty wasn't a personal failing, that the systems were stacked against people like her. The evening light streaming through the diner windows reminded Maya of her grandmother's kitchen, where she'd spent countless afternoons after school while her mother worked. Abuela Rosa had been a master of making something from nothing, transforming leftover beans and rice into feasts that filled both the stomach and the soul. She'd told Maya stories about coming to America with nothing but hope and determination, about cleaning houses and taking in sewing to support her family while learning English from television programs. Rosa had lived long enough to see Maya start college, had pressed $100 bill into her granddaughter's hand, with tears in her eyes, saying it was for books, but knowing it would probably go toward rent. Maya wished desperately that her grandmother was still alive to see her through this difficult time, to offer the kind of wisdom that could only come from surviving hardships and emerging stronger. The memory of her grandmother's hands, weathered from decades of hard work but always gentle when they smoothed Maya's hair or wiped away her tears, brought fresh sadness to Maya's chest. Rosa had died believing that Maya would fulfill all the dreams that had been deferred for generations, that education would be the key to breaking the cycle of financial struggle that had defined their family's American story. Maya felt like she was failing, not just herself but the memory of every woman in her lineage who had sacrificed and struggled and hoped for something better. The weight of that responsibility sometimes felt crushing, especially on days like today, when the gap between dreams and reality seemed as wide as the desert that surrounded their small city. As her shift neared its end and the diner began to empty of dinner customers, Maya found herself thinking again about Harold and the gratitude in his eyes when she'd saved him from the scammer. It had felt good to help someone, to use her knowledge and awareness to protect a vulnerable person from being taken advantage of. In that moment, she'd felt like the person she'd always wanted to be, someone who made a positive difference in the world, however small. The feeling had been brief but powerful, a reminder that even in her current circumstances, she still had something valuable to offer. She tucked that memory away like a small treasure, something to hold on to during the long evening ahead, when she'd count her tips and try to figure out which bill to pay first, and wonder if tomorrow might somehow be different from today. Maya looked out at the darkening sky and felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and determination that had become her daily companion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices between impossible options, new reminders of all the dreams she'd had to set aside. But it would also bring new opportunities to help, to care, to make someone's day a little brighter, even if she couldn't yet figure out how to brighten her own. She didn't know that her encounter with Harold that morning had set something in motion, that her small act of kindness would eventually return to her in ways she couldn't imagine. All she knew was that she'd done the right thing, and sometimes in a life filled with limited choices, doing the right thing had to be enough to keep her going until something better came along. The last customer of her shift left a $5 tip on a $12 meal, and Maya felt a flicker of gratitude that almost brought tears to her eyes. Small kindnesses from strangers had become precious to her, brief moments of connection in days that often felt isolating and overwhelming. She cleaned the table slowly, savoring the brief quiet before the night shift arrived, before she'd have to face another evening of counting money that would never be enough, and trying to stay hopeful in the face of circumstances that seemed designed to crush optimism. The arithmetic of survival was relentless, but Maya had learned to find moments of grace even in the most difficult calculations, and tonight, the memory of helping Harold would be part of the equation that kept her moving forward into whatever tomorrow might bring. 3 days after the incident with the phone scammer, Maya was wiping down tables during the slow Thursday afternoon lull when she noticed a familiar figure through the diner's front window. Harold Whitman stood on the sidewalk, but he wasn't alone. A younger man in an expensive suit accompanied him, along with a woman carrying what appeared to be official-looking folders. Maya's heart skipped as she watched Harold gesture toward the diner, his expression animated in a way she'd never seen before. The group moved with purpose, their conversation intense and focused, and Maya felt an inexplicable flutter of nervousness as they approached the entrance. She smoothed her uniform and tried to shake off the feeling that this visit was somehow different from Harold's usual quiet breakfast routine. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair as he pulled open the door, and Maya noticed that his usual gentle demeanor seemed charged with an energy she couldn't quite identify. "Maya, dear, I hope you have a few minutes to talk," Harold said as he approached her section, his voice carrying a warmth that made several other customers glance up from their meals. The formality of his companions made Maya suddenly self-conscious about her appearance, her hair escaping from its ponytail, her uniform wrinkled from the morning rush, her hands still damp from clearing tables. The woman with the folders smiled professionally, but her eyes held an appraising quality that made Maya feel like she was being evaluated for something she didn't understand. The man in the suit checked his watch and glanced around the diner with the air of someone accustomed to much different surroundings. Maya felt the familiar weight of class difference pressing down on her, the invisible but palpable distance between her world and theirs. She gestured toward Harold's usual booth, her hands trembling slightly as she wondered what could be so important that it required witnesses and official documentation. Harold settled into the booth with the careful movements of a man whose age showed more in his joints than his spirit, while his companions remained standing as if they were part of some formal ceremony Maya wasn't prepared for. "Maya, I want you to meet my attorney, James Morrison, and my personal assistant, Catherine Wells," Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of authority Maya had never heard from him before. The words hit her like a physical force. Attorney, personal assistant, terms that belonged to a world so far removed from her daily reality that they might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. Maya felt her legs grow unsteady as the implications began to register. Harold wasn't just a kind elderly gentleman who ordered the senior breakfast special. He was someone wealthy enough to have lawyers and assistants, someone whose world operated according to rules and resources she'd never encountered. The realization made her previous assumptions about their interaction seem naive and painfully limited. "Maya, I need to tell you who I am," Harold continued, his eyes gentle but serious. "I'm Harold Whitman of Whitman Industries. Perhaps you've heard of us?" Maya's breath caught in her throat as recognition flooded through her. Whitman Industries. The name was everywhere in California, on buildings and billboards associated with construction projects that shaped entire cities. She'd seen the logo countless times, without ever connecting it to the quiet man who sat in her section reading the newspaper and leaving modest tips. Harold Whitman wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most powerful businessmen on the West Coast, someone whose decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. The scope of his influence made Maya's head spin as she tried to reconcile this revelation with the vulnerable grandfather she'd helped 3 days ago. The scammer's target hadn't been a random elderly man. It had been someone whose financial loss would have made headlines. Catherine Wells opened her folder and withdrew several documents, her movements precise and professional. "Mr. Whitman wanted to properly thank you for your intervention on Tuesday," she said, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to handling significant transactions. "The scam you prevented would have cost him approximately $15,000, the amount the criminals typically extract before victims realize what's happening." Maya's eyes widened at the figure, a sum that represented more money than she'd seen in her entire life combined. She thought about her own desperate financial calculations, the way she agonized over every $20 expense, and felt overwhelmed by the casual way Catherine mentioned such a staggering amount. The mathematics of wealth and poverty had never been illustrated so starkly. The distance between Harold's world and hers measured not just in dollars, but in the fundamental security that money provided. "But that's not why I'm here," Harold said, leaning forward with an intensity that commanded Maya's full attention. "What you did took courage, Maya. You risked your job, potentially created a confrontation with a customer, all to protect someone you barely knew. That kind of character is rare." His words made Maya's cheeks burn with embarrassment and pride in equal measure. She'd acted on instinct, following moral principles her grandmother had instilled in her, never imagining that her simple intervention would be viewed as anything extraordinary. But sitting across from Harold now, seeing the genuine respect in his eyes and the formal acknowledgement of his professional associates, Maya began to understand that her actions had created ripples extending far beyond that Tuesday morning. The weight of his attention felt both validating and terrifying, as if she were being offered something too good to be real. James Morrison cleared his throat and consulted his own set of papers. "Mr. Whitman has been researching your background, Maya, and he's quite impressed with what he's discovered." Maya felt a chill run through her as she realized her privacy had been invaded, her struggles examined and catalogued by strangers. The thought of wealthy people dissecting her life, analyzing her poverty and her family's struggles, made her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that was almost unbearable. But Harold must have sensed her discomfort, because he reached across the table and patted her hand gently. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, dear. But when someone shows the kind of integrity you displayed, I believe in learning more about who they really are, and what I learned has only confirmed my initial impression." His explanation didn't eliminate Maya's unease, but his sincerity helped her understand that his investigation had been motivated by respect rather than mere curiosity. "You dropped out of community college to care for your mother during her cancer treatment," Catherine continued, reading from her notes with professional detachment. "You've been working multiple jobs to support your family, maintaining excellent performance reviews, despite personal challenges that would overwhelm most people your age." Maya squirmed as her life was summarized in clinical terms, her struggles reduced to bullet points on official documents, but she also felt a strange validation, hearing her efforts acknowledged by people who understood success in ways she'd never imagined. The gap between her self-perception, as someone barely keeping her head above water, and their assessment of her as someone worthy of admiration, was difficult to process. She'd spent so many months feeling like a failure that being viewed as impressive by successful people seemed almost impossible to believe. Harold's expression grew more serious as he prepared to make his point. "Maya, I'm 74 years old and I've built my company by recognizing talent and character when I see it. What happened on Tuesday wasn't just about preventing a scam. It was about you seeing a situation, understanding what was happening, and having the courage to act on someone else's behalf despite the potential consequences to yourself." Maya felt tears prick her eyes as Harold articulated something she hadn't been able to express about her own actions. She'd helped him because it was the right thing to do, because her conscience wouldn't let her stand by while someone was being victimized. But hearing it described as a demonstration of business acumen and leadership potential felt like discovering hidden strengths she'd never recognized in herself. "I have a proposition for you," Harold said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to making life-changing offers. Maya's heart began to race as she sensed that whatever came next would alter the trajectory of her entire existence. The diner around them seemed to fade away, the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and casual conversation becoming distant background noise as she focused entirely on Harold's words. Catherine and James exchanged a look that suggested they were witnessing something significant, something that had been carefully planned and orchestrated. Maya gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor herself to something solid as she prepared to hear an offer that seemed too good to be real, too transformative to be offered to someone like her. "I'm looking for a personal assistant," Harold continued, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. "Someone I can trust completely, someone with the intelligence to understand complex situations and the integrity to always act in my best interests. The position comes with a salary of $65,000 annually, full health insurance, and opportunities for advancement within my organization." Maya felt the words hit her like a physical blow, the numbers so far beyond her current reality that she struggled to process their meaning. $65,000 was more than 3 times what she earned in a year of double shifts and weekend work. Health insurance meant her mother could get the care she needed without the constant fear of bankruptcy. The offer represented not just financial security, but a complete transformation of their lives, a chance to escape the cycle of poverty that had seemed inescapable. But Maya's mind immediately began cataloging all the reasons why she wasn't qualified for such a position. She'd never worked in an office, never managed complex schedules, or handled confidential business matters. Her wardrobe consisted of uniforms and discount clothes inappropriate for a corporate environment. She didn't even own a decent computer, or have experience with the kind of software systems such a job would require. The gap between Harold's offer and her qualifications seemed insurmountable, and Maya felt the familiar, crushing weight of imposter syndrome threatening to overwhelm her. "Mr. Whitman, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't have the experience or education for that kind of position," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she voiced her deepest fears about her own inadequacy. Harold smiled at her response, but it wasn't the patronizing expression she'd feared. Instead, his smile conveyed understanding and patience, the look of someone who had anticipated her objections and was prepared to address them. "Maya, experience can be taught, education can be provided, but integrity, intelligence, and courage, those are qualities you either have or you don't, and you've demonstrated all 3 in abundance." Catherine nodded in agreement, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she watched Maya struggle with the magnitude of what was being offered. James Morrison closed his folder and leaned back, his expression suggesting that this conversation was following a script they'd all prepared for. Maya felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, being offered a chance to fly but terrified that she would fall instead. The weight of the moment pressed down on Maya as she realized that her response would determine not just her own future, but her mother's as well. Health insurance could mean Elena getting the treatments she needed without the constant worry about cost. A stable salary could mean moving out of their cramped apartment into a place with better air conditioning for her mother's breathing problems. It could mean Maya returning to school, finishing her degree, building toward the kind of future she'd thought was lost forever. But it could also mean entering a world where she didn't belong, where her working-class background and limited formal education would make her an outsider among people who spoke in acronyms and attended meetings about things she didn't understand. The fear of failure warred with the desperate hope for a better life, creating an internal conflict that left her trembling with uncertainty. "I don't need an answer today," Harold said gently, seeming to understand the magnitude of what he was asking Maya to consider. "Take some time to think about it. Discuss it with your mother. This is a big decision, and I want you to be completely comfortable with whatever choice you make." Catherine placed a business card on the table between them, her movements deliberate and formal. "My contact information is there. When you're ready to talk, call me, and we'll arrange for you to visit the office, meet the team, see if it feels like the right fit." Maya stared at the elegant cardstock, the embossed logo representing a world of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. The simple rectangle of paper felt heavier than any tip she'd ever received, weighted with the potential to change everything about her life's direction. Harold stood slowly, his movements careful but purposeful, while his associates gathered their materials with the efficiency of people accustomed to conducting important business in unexpected venues. "Maya, you saved me from more than just financial loss on Tuesday. You reminded me that there are still people in this world who do the right thing simply because it's right. That's worth more than any amount of money." His words carried the weight of genuine emotion, and Maya felt tears threatening to spill over as she realized that her small act of kindness had been viewed as something precious and rare. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the diner windows seemed brighter somehow, illuminating a moment that felt suspended between her old life and whatever might come next. As Harold and his team prepared to leave, Maya knew that regardless of her ultimate decision, this conversation had already changed her forever. The business card remained on the table after they left, its presence both promise and challenge, as Maya tried to process everything that had just occurred. The familiar surroundings of the diner, the worn vinyl booths, the scratched linoleum floor, the smell of coffee and grease that had become the backdrop of her daily existence, suddenly felt different, as if she were seeing them through new eyes. Her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser showed the same tired young woman who'd started her shift that morning, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between Harold's arrival and departure. Maya picked up the business card with trembling fingers, studying Catherine Wells's name and contact information as if they were written in a language she was still learning to read. The possibility of escape from her current circumstances felt both thrilling and terrifying, a doorway opening onto a future she couldn't quite envision but desperately wanted to believe in. Maya sat at her mother's bedside that evening, Catherine Wells's business card trembling in her hands as she tried to find the words to explain what had happened at the diner. Elena Rodriguez looked smaller than usual against the faded pillows, her once vibrant hair now thin and grey from the chemotherapy treatments that had become their monthly ritual of hope and exhaustion. The apartment felt smaller too, the walls seeming to press inward, as Maya contemplated the possibility of leaving this familiar prison for something that felt impossibly vast and uncertain. "Mija, you look like you've seen a ghost," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the gentle concern that had been Maya's anchor through every storm they'd weathered together. Maya took a shaky breath and began to tell her mother about Harold Whitman's offer, watching Elena's expression cycle through disbelief, wonder, and something that looked dangerously close to fear. $65,000, Elena repeated, her voice barely a whisper as she struggled to comprehend the number. Maya nodded, feeling the weight of the figure settling between them like a presence that changed the very air in the room. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but Maya couldn't tell if they were tears of joy or terror. "Maya, that's more money than your father and I ever made in our best year together. That's a different life entirely." Eleanor's words carried the recognition that such an opportunity would fundamentally alter not just their financial circumstances, but their entire social reality. Maya watched her mother's face as Elena processed what the offer meant. Better healthcare, a safer neighborhood, the possibility of dignity in her illness rather than the constant scramble to afford basic medications. But Maya also saw the fear in her mother's eyes, the terror of hoping for something so large that its loss would be unbearable. The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night, mother and daughter weighing dreams against dangers, possibilities against the paralyzing fear of failure. Elena worried about Maya entering a world where she might lose herself, where the values they'd fought so hard to maintain might be compromised by the pressure to fit in among people who had never struggled as they had. Maya shared her own fears about inadequacy, about being exposed as someone who didn't belong in boardrooms and business meetings, about the possibility that Harold's faith in her was misplaced. They talked about Maya's grandmother Rosa, about the sacrifices that had led to this moment, about whether accepting help from a wealthy man represented opportunity or dependence. Eleanor reached for Maya's hand with fingers that felt fragile as bird bones, her touch carrying decades of love and worry and the complicated mathematics of maternal protection. "What does your heart tell you, Misha?" Eleanor asked, as the first light of dawn began to filter through their thin curtains. Maya closed her eyes and tried to listen past her fears, past the voice that insisted she wasn't good enough, past the comfortable familiarity of struggle that had become their normal. What she heard was the echo of her grandmother's stories about courage, about the leap of faith required to build something better from nothing. She heard Harold's voice describing integrity and intelligence as rare qualities, heard his genuine respect for her actions, but she also heard the whispered warnings of a lifetime spent learning that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. The tension between hope and caution created an ache in her chest that felt like her heart was being pulled in two directions simultaneously. Maya returned to work that Friday morning with a new awareness of how temporary her current situation might be, and the familiar routine of serving coffee and clearing tables felt different, as if she was seeing it from a distance. Her co-workers noticed her distraction immediately. Janet commented that Maya seemed off, and Carl, the cook, asked twice if she was feeling sick, but Maya couldn't explain that she was experiencing a kind of emotional vertigo, caught between two possible futures that seemed equally real and equally impossible. Every interaction with customers reminded her of the class dynamics she'd never paid much attention to before, the subtle ways that money created invisible barriers between people. She found herself studying the businessmen who ordered lunch, trying to imagine herself in their world, trying to picture herself as someone whose concerns extended beyond daily survival. The lunch rush brought an unexpected confrontation when Maya's former high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson, came in with a group of teachers celebrating someone's birthday. Maya felt her stomach clench as she recognized the woman who had encouraged her to pursue college, who had helped her fill out financial aid applications, who had believed in Maya's potential when Maya herself had barely dared to hope. Mrs. Henderson's face lit up with recognition and then quickly shifted to concern as she took in Maya's uniform, the setting, the obvious reality of where Maya's life had led after dropping out of school. "Maya Rodriguez, how wonderful to see you. Are you still planning to finish your degree?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, highlighting the gap between the future they'd both envisioned and the present reality of serving coffee to pay for her mother's medical bills. Maya felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. Shame at being seen in her current circumstances, anger at the assumption that her choices had been freely made rather than forced by circumstances beyond her control. "I'm taking some time off to help my mother through her illness," Maya replied, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge that made the other teachers exchange glances. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened with understanding, and something that might have been pity, which somehow made Maya feel worse than the initial judgment had. The conversation continued for a few more painful minutes, filled with well-meaning questions about Maya's plans and offers of help that felt both genuine and impossible to accept. Maya served their table with professional courtesy, while internally screaming at the cosmic unfairness that had placed this encounter on the same day she was grappling with Harold's life-changing offer. After the teachers left, Maya found herself in the bathroom, staring at her reflection and fighting back tears of frustration and confusion. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's surprise at finding her here, about the assumptions people made about success and failure, about the invisible factors that determined who got opportunities and who got trapped in cycles of limitation. The business card in her pocket felt like both a lifeline and a betrayal of everyone who was still trapped in circumstances similar to her current ones. If she accepted Harold's offer, would she be escaping or abandoning? Would she be proving that hard work pays off or demonstrating that success requires wealthy benefactors rather than personal merit? The questions spiraled through her mind without resolution, each one spawning 3 more doubts. The afternoon brought another unexpected visitor when Maya's former college roommate, Jessica, appeared at the diner counter during the slow period between lunch and dinner. Jessica looked every inch the successful young professional she'd become. Tailored blazer, confident posture, expensive handbag, and the particular glow that came from having one's plans work out exactly as intended. Maya felt the familiar stab of envy mixed with genuine affection as she hugged her old friend, acutely aware of the contrast between Jessica's polished appearance and her own grease-stained uniform. Jessica had completed her business degree, landed an entry-level position at a marketing firm in Los Angeles, and was already talking about graduate school and 5-year plans that included home ownership and retirement savings. Her success felt both inspiring and accusatory, a reminder of the path Maya might have taken if circumstances had been different. "Maya, I've been thinking about you so much lately," Jessica said, her voice carrying the particular tone people used when they wanted to help, but weren't sure how. "I keep wondering if there's anything I can do, any connections I could make for you. I know some people who might be hiring, and with your work ethic and people skills." Jessica's offer trailed off as she seemed to realize the complexity of Maya's situation, the way responsibilities and limitations intertwined to create barriers that networking alone couldn't overcome. Maya felt a surge of affection for her friend's genuine concern, but also a defensive anger at the implication that her current circumstances were simply a matter of not having the right connections. The conversation that followed was careful and kind, but Maya could feel the growing distance between their realities, the way success and struggle created different vocabularies for discussing the future. When Jessica left with promises to stay in touch and invitations to visit Los Angeles that they both knew Maya couldn't accept, Maya felt the weight of isolation settling around her like a familiar coat. Everyone in her life seemed to exist in a different reality. Her mother trapped in illness and worry, her former classmates moving forward with careers and relationships, her co-workers resigned to circumstances they'd stopped trying to change. Harold's offer existed outside all of these familiar frameworks, representing a possibility so different from anything in her experience that it might as well have been offered in a foreign language. Maya realized that accepting or declining the position would require her to make a choice, not just about her career but about her identity, about who she believed herself to be and who she had the courage to become. The evening shift brought the usual mix of regulars and travelers, but Maya moved through her routines with a new sense of detachment, as if she were watching her life from outside her body. She observed herself taking orders, filling coffee cups, and making small talk with customers, cataloging these familiar actions as if she were already preparing to remember them rather than live them. The thought of never again smelling the particular combination of coffee and grease that had become the backdrop of her adult life filled her with unexpected sadness. This job had been a trap, but it had also been a refuge, a place where she knew exactly what was expected of her and how to exceed those expectations. Harold's offer promised growth and challenge, but it also promised uncertainty and the possibility of failure on a much larger scale. As her shift neared its end, Maya found herself thinking about courage in a new way. She'd always associated bravery with dramatic moments like the one when she'd stopped Harold from being scammed, but now she realized that accepting his offer would require a different kind of courage, the bravery to believe in possibilities that contradicted everything her experience had taught her about her place in the world. The safe choice would be to decline the offer, to continue struggling in familiar ways, rather than risk failing in unfamiliar ones. But safety, Maya realized, was also a kind of prison, a limitation disguised as protection. Her mother's illness had taught her that security was largely an illusion anyway, that circumstances could change without warning, regardless of how carefully one planned and prepared. That night, Maya sat in her car outside the apartment complex, staring up at the lighted windows where families lived lives that ranged from comfortable to desperate, all of them contained within the same weathered buildings that had housed her dreams and disappointments for 3 years. She thought about her neighbors, the single mother working 2 jobs to support her kids, the elderly man whose social security barely covered his rent, the young couple fighting about money in voices that carried through the thin walls. These were her people, the community that had formed around shared struggle and mutual support. If she accepted Harold's offer, would she be leaving them behind or would she be proving that escape was possible? The question felt impossibly heavy as she climbed the stairs to face another night of weighing hopes against fears, dreams against the terrible possibility that some dreams were too big for someone like her. Maya looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror before bed, seeing the same face that had stared back at her every morning for 22 years, but somehow different now, marked by the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. She thought about Harold's words about integrity and intelligence, about Catherine's professional confidence in reading her qualifications, about her mother's trembling hope and fear. The business card lay on her dresser like a small bridge between 2 worlds, waiting for her to find the courage to cross it, or the wisdom to stay where she belonged. Tomorrow would bring another day of serving coffee and counting tips, but it would also bring her closer to a choice that would prove whether she had the strength to trust in possibilities larger than her current circumstances, whether she could be brave enough to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspired to lift people up rather than keep them down. The weight of potential transformation pressed against Maya's chest as she lay in the darkness, listening to her mother's steady breathing from the next room and the distant sound of traffic on the highway that led to everywhere she'd never been. Harold's offer represented more than a job. It was an invitation to become someone she'd never imagined she could be, to step into a story larger than the one she'd been writing with careful, limited strokes. The fear of inadequacy warred with a growing recognition that staying safe might be the most dangerous choice of all, that the real risk lay not in failing at something difficult, but in never attempting it at all. As sleep finally claimed her, Maya carried with her the growing certainty that tomorrow would be the day she found the courage to call Catherine Wells and step into whatever came next, ready to discover whether she had the strength to transform not just her circumstances, but herself. Maya's hands shook as she dialed Catherine Wells's number the next morning, her mother's encouraging smile providing the courage she needed to bridge two worlds with a simple phone call. "Catherine, this is Maya Rodriguez. I'd like to accept Mr. Whitman's offer." The words felt foreign on her tongue, like speaking a language of possibility she was just learning to understand. Catherine's warm response and immediate scheduling of orientation meetings made the transformation feel suddenly, overwhelmingly real. 3 months later, Maya sat in her new office on the 20th floor of Whitman Industries, looking out over the Bakersfield skyline she'd only ever seen from street level. Her mother's latest medical reports showed improvement. The stress reduction and quality health care had worked miracles that money couldn't directly buy, but had certainly made possible. Elena had moved into a bright apartment with central air conditioning and a small garden where she grew the tomatoes she'd dreamed about for years. The sight of her mother's hands in soil instead of clutching medical bills had become Maya's daily reminder that some risks were worth taking. The learning curve had been steep and sometimes humiliating. Maya had stumbled through her first board meeting, mispronounced industry terms, and spent countless evenings studying business practices that seemed like a foreign language. But Harold had been patient, assigning her a mentor and celebrating small victories with the same enthusiasm he'd shown that first day in the diner. "Excellence isn't about perfection, Maya," he'd told her during a particularly difficult week. "It's about growing into the person you're meant to become." His faith in her abilities had gradually become her own self-confidence, transforming doubt into determination one challenge at a time. Maya's role had evolved beyond Harold's personal assistant into something resembling a community liaison, connecting Whitman Industries with local organizations and charitable causes. She'd proposed a scholarship program for students like herself, those whose potential exceeded their circumstances, and Harold had approved the funding without hesitation. Watching the first recipients receive their awards had felt like watching her own dreams multiply and extend to others who needed hope as desperately as she once had. The diner still operated on Route 9, and Maya visited occasionally, leaving generous tips and carrying messages from Harold to the staff who'd witnessed their first encounter. Carl still worked the grill, Janet still struggled with her own challenges, and the familiar smells of coffee and grease triggered memories of desperation that felt like echoes from another lifetime. She'd offered Janet a position in Whitman's cafeteria, better pay, health insurance, and dignity, but understood when Janet declined, not yet ready to believe in transformations that seemed too good to be real. 1 year after that first phone call, Maya stood in the same spot where she'd warned Harold about the scammer, now wearing a tailored suit and carrying herself with confidence that came from discovering her own worth. She thought about the mathematics of kindness, how one moment of courage had multiplied into opportunities she'd never dared imagine. Her grandmother Rosa would have recognized this moment as the fulfillment of generations of hope, the proof that sometimes the universe conspires to reward those who choose compassion over comfort. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe that their current circumstances don't define their future possibilities. Sometimes a single act of kindness creates ripples that transform not just one life, but entire communities of hope.